All right, y'all, got another classic throwback here for you. Glenn Greenwald and Bill Maher vehemently debating foreign policy, Islam, and a couple different issues. This clip is a little bit short, but there's a lot of substance packed in there. So this was, it doesn't say the year. Comment from 10 months ago. Huh. Yeah, I want to say this has to be between like 2011 and 2014, something like that. But I'm just guessing. Anyway, let's watch.
It's not our fault what came out. We didn't go into Egypt.
Well, we
wound up with the Muslim Brotherhood.
We didn't go into Egypt. We were supporting and propping up Mubarak for 30 years, even as we were cheering for all the Tahrir Square demonstrators as though we were on their side.
Yep, that's factual. They're talking about the Arab Spring, and Mubarak was overthrown, and then Mohammed Morsi was voted in at the time. And there were these massive protests in Egypt, and that's what they're talking about here.
It was our government that kept Mubarak in power, just like we've done across the entire Muslim world. And it's amazing for you to say that, well, look at all these Muslims. The minute you give them a little bit of freedom, they go wild and they start being all violent. How can you be a citizen of the United States, the country that has generated more violence and militarism in the world over the last 5 or 6 decades, and say, look at those people over there, they are incredibly violent? We play a significant role in what has been happening in the Middle East because we've been interfering and dominating that region in order to have access to the oil.
I wasn't talking about violence. I was talking about theocracy. That doesn't happen here.
No, well, okay.
Look, you could argue about the extent and the degree to which theocracy happens, but I mean, granted, we have the benefit of hindsight now, right? And now we live in a country where Roe versus Wade was thrown out. Now, their logic for it, their reasoning for it was not explicitly theocratic, but the ends are undeniably theocratic. Undeniably. And of course, back in the Bush years, they ran an entire election on being against gay marriage. They wanted a constitutional amendment to ban gay marriage. So again, you could argue about the degrees of theocracy and theocratic control, but there's definitely a strong element of that in the U.S. There's a solid 25 or 30% base, which, man, they would roll the clocks back on all the social progress in an instant if they could.
That doesn't happen here, but at the same time, Iran isn't invading lots of other countries and occupying them for a decade, nor are fundamentalist Muslim countries the way the United States is. So these things are interlinked because...
Well, now we know Saudi Arabia is doing that. They're doing a genocide in Yemen. But that's a side point. I'm just being pedantic.
We are continuously interfering in that part of the world. And so to say...
Really, it's all our fault?
It's not all our fault, but when you send your military for 6 straight decades into other countries to bomb them, kill their children and women and innocent men, prop up dictators, you take responsibility for your actions and say, to the extent that region...
That religion...
I think what Glenn's saying here is kind of undeniable. Like, I don't think your average American knows the extent to which we have meddled in and intervened with countries in the Middle East. I mean, Western powers basically drew the map in the Middle East, and we did it very arbitrarily. Sometimes we did it along sectarian lines. Sometimes we did it as a direct result of getting access to natural resources. So, yeah, we've been directly involved in that region, and like Glenn points out, we propped up dictators in many countries. That leads to, massive issues and social unrest, and we've exploited the region. That's totally separate and apart from the conversation about our outright wars that we've waged there, whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq. So, yeah. Now, it's funny because Maher does oftentimes take, especially back in these days, non-interventionist positions on these wars. But Maher is struggling with that instinct he has, the war bad instinct, but also the Islam bad instinct that he has. So he's trying to say, oh, you can't blame us for a lot of these problems because, these are effectively these are just backwards Muslims who can't govern themselves and they're savage and barbaric, etc. And Glenn is pointing out well, first of all, that's not true. Second of all, we are directly responsible for a lot of the stuff happening there now. So this was the crux of the debate at the time. And of course, this branches out into the larger conversation and the larger debate, which was between, the lefties and the new atheists at the time. I'm sure you guys remember going back, or maybe many of you don't. I don't know, but I'm sure there's some in the audience who remember when Sam Harris and Glenn Greenwald would be at each other's throats on a regular basis. You had Reza Aslan versus Sam Harris, and there was that famous real-time moment where it was like Ben Affleck versus Bill Maher and Sam Harris, and the debate was on, Islam and Muslims and the effects of a religious ideology. But Glenn's point here is to really hone in on the fact that it's arrogant of anybody in the West to talk about that, since first and foremost, our government bears, or our governments bear, a lot of the responsibility for what's happened in these countries because of our brutal control from the outside. Our putting dictators in power, our stealing the natural resources, are being the world's sole superpower and empire. And so Glenn is not really interested in that latter conversation about Islam, because he's like, hey, dipshit, let's first address the fact that we're responsible for a lot of the fucked up shit that's happening over there, which is a perfectly understandable instinct. And it really is the Noam Chomsky rule, which is like, don't be a hypocrite. Take care of your own shit and criticize your own country and what we're responsible for before you criticize the actions of other countries or other individuals, because he says criticizing the other countries and the other individuals for what they do wrong has about as much utility as criticizing something that happened in the year 1784. Like, you could do it, but what does it matter? You should take care of the things that you can take care of and that you're responsible for.
It goes back 1,000 years before our revolution. So I don't think we can take all the blame.
I don't think we should. I think we should take a lot of it. And there's lots of bodies and corpses that have been piled up in the name of Christianity and Judaism as well.
Not recently.
Have you heard of the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza for the last 50 years, motivated in part by extremist views of Judaism, or the wars in Europe, or the fact that there were generals in the United States saying we have to go and invade and destroy Iraq, a country of 26 million people, because our God is bigger? Lots of religions, not just Islam, produce violence.
Well, if I could just make one quick point about Egypt.
That silly liberal view that all religions are alike because it makes you feel good.
No, it makes you feel good to say our side is better. The people over there are primitive and violent. No, it makes you feel good to put a crown on your head and say, I'm a good person. How do I prove that? You get to ignore the responsibility that your own government has for the violence and instability in the world by saying, look, it's that primitive religion over there that's to blame.
Oh, Jesus. I don't know after this how many times Glenn Greenwald was invited back on. Oh, man. I mean, look, it was an intense debate, and it is definitely indicative of the times. I remember similar debates happening all over the place. And look, my position, is something I'm sure a lot of you guys know, but just to sum it up for everybody who doesn't, my position is that it's not inherently Islamophobic or bigoted against Muslims to criticize the doctrine of Islam, in the same way that you can criticize the terrible parts of the Bible and Christianity without saying, I think all Christians are inferior people, right? And so you have to be consistent in your standard with what you're allowed to criticize. So I think it's totally fine to have the conversation about theocracy in the Middle East or elsewhere. You can have that conversation. You can criticize theocracy. You could say that's not the way to go. Some sort of secular, humanist, democratic approach is always better and always going to bring about human rights for more people. You could say that while also acknowledging that a lot of the conversations at the time were arrogant, where the U.S. would kill massive numbers of innocent civilians and overthrow governments and create all these problems. And then the narrative would flip and be like, man, look at all these problems over there. It's definitely because they're, savage barbarians who have a backwards religion. And it's like, wait, what? What are you talking about? How is that at all relevant to the conversation of what we did to foster these terrible environments? And so I think there are some valid arguments that you hear from different positions in this debate, but ultimately, I think it really was a deflection and an obfuscation for people to sort of ruthlessly harp away on the other, as opposed to pointing out the things the U.S. was responsible for and Western powers were responsible for in regards to the Middle East. Because again, we drew a lot of the lines on the maps, and they were very arbitrary. And then we also exploited the region, and it took the oil. And so we sort of laid the groundwork and planted the seeds for the future revolutions and political instability. But like when those revolutions happen and when the instability bubbles up, we act like, Western governments had nothing to do with it at all. And I think that's silly. So I think that the general consensus in this back and forth was that Glenn Greenwald got the better of Bill Maher, and I think that's true.